Hello everyone and welcome to 18-2 Ecology of Organisms. So today we're going to be talking about where an organism lives, being its habitat, but why it lives there and what part of its habitat does it use, and then what is the difference between acclimation and adaptation. So biotic and abiotic factors, both biotic or living factors and abiotic or non-living factors influence organisms. So biotic factors can be anything alive. It can be the interactions between these living things. It can be uh, how the living thing interacts with the non-living things. It just has to be living, which we went over what constitutes as living in a previous lecture. Abiotic factors are like climate, temperature, precipitation, uh, natural disasters, pH. Those are all abiotic factors, things that aren't alive, but they still affect living things. So in the bottom you see we have the abiotic factor of sunlight and the biotic factor of a giraffe. Abiotic and biotic factors are interdependent, meaning we depend on each other. So the example that we have here is the availability of nitrogen in soil affects how fast plants can grow. And plants affect nitrogen availability by absorbing the nitrogen from the soil. So to give a good example of this, we have a plant, and that plant is going to absorb nitrogen from the soil. And that plant needs that nitrogen to grow. Well, how does the soil get that nitrogen back? Well, when the plant dies and decomposes, that nitrogen that was in the plant goes back into the soil. So it's interdependent in that way. Abiotic factors can vary from place to place and over time. So, for example, temperature. Even where we live right now, we can have the temperature vary from one side of the city to another side of the city. That is a big difference. We can even have it vary from state to state. Think about it. In Nevada alone, there is times where Las Vegas is sunny and has wind and everything, where Reno is snowing. So because of this, it can affect temperature, how much rain a place is getting, how much wind a place is getting, and from there, because of the biotic and abiotic factors. So for example, trees. If we have an island that is covered in trees, the wind is going to go and hit different parts of the island differently because of it's hitting the trees first. And then temperature can also affect with trees, like the shade of a tree is different than being in direct sunlight. So here we see a tolerance curve. And this tolerance curve, get a laser pointer out. This tolerance curve is showing how organisms are able to survive within a limited amount of range. So if it is an optimum tolerance, the amount of living factor, or the amount of the limiting factor is just right, we get the abundant individuals. And if you can see here, this is what we see here. This is the bell curve. Now, if we have too much of a limiting factor, we can get few individuals to even no individuals. Where if we have too little, we can get few to no individuals. And then we have these zones. The zone of physiological stress is where there is the maximum or minimum amount that is truly needed. And then you have the zone of intolerance where no individuals can live. A great example of this is if you look at a mountain. When you look at a mountain, you can see parts where you get the trees starting to thin out. That's the zone of physiological stress. And then where there is no trees at all, and that's the zone of intolerance. So we have that specific range that we can live in. An organism can survive and function in conditions outside of our optimal range, but its performance is greatly reduced. So, for example, in Argentina, in the mountains over there, you have people who can live in higher levels of those mountains and they acclimate to those areas and they can live there, but performance, like how long they can run and compared to if they lived on sea level, is greatly reduced. So acclimation, this is how we can adjust our tolerance to abiotic factors through the process of acclimation. So we've been using the word adapt wrong for years. The word we should be using is acclimate. So when we're saying we're getting used to something, we're acclimating, not adapting. So acclimation is when we adjust our tolerance to abiotic factors. So if you were to move from somewhere really hot to really cold, the first year it's going to be terrible. Second year it might be just as bad. But the longer you live there, your body will start to get used to that cold and used to being there. And so you acclimate, you get used to the cold. Same thing if you went from somewhere really cold to where we are now, where we are in Las Vegas. It gets really hot here. The summers can get up to normally anywhere from 110 to 115 on average, but we can go up to about the 120s. So that is where it's like you can start getting used to the heat, and then you eventually just get used to it where it's a part of everyday life. It's acclimation. We are getting used to it. We're not adapting to it. Adapting is something else. Acclimation can occur in your lifetime. You get used to it. Adaptation is a genetic change. This is a change in your DNA in a species or in a population, and this occurs from generation to generation over time. So this means that there's a DNA genetic change, and that gets passed down to the next generation. And that change helps them, and it's reproduced down to another generation, and so on and so forth. It has to be something that can help you survive, and that can help that you can pass down, that helps you reproduce. And if you have both of those and it gets passed down, then it is favorable and it'll be an adaptation to future generations. So for example, on this one, when we look at tigers, a tiger, uh, so we have a tiger and then we have the Siberian tigers. Well, let's go to the very first few Siberian tigers. They were white, they didn't match with everything. However, they matched it, if they moved, if they migrated, they matched in with the snow. And that was an adaptation that helped them survive. So then that helped them reproduce, survive and reproduce, and pass that adaptation down. It's not something that changed within them during their lifetime, it was something they were born with. So control of internal conditions, this is a conformer or a regulator. A conformer is an organism that does not regulate internal conditions. So we are conformers. And then we can change as our external environment changes. A regulator uses the energy from outside to control internal conditions. So the snake in our classroom, that's a regulator. Other words for this is a homeotherm for conformer. Homeo meaning same, therm, heat. So we can keep our own heat. We are homeotherms, we're conformers. And then poikilotherm for a regulator. So the snake is a poikilotherm, the snake is a regulator. It uses the heat from the outside to control its temperature. So take a moment, think, what are these turtles? Are they homeotherms or conformers? Or are they poikilotherms or regulators? So we can escape from unsuitable conditions. This is through a couple of different things. We can either hibernate by becoming dormant, or we can migrate. So migrate is we leaving from an unsuitable place, or that's migrate. Hibernate is us sleeping for long periods of time. Now, this can be hibernation is two different types. We have long-term hibernation, which is like months to a season. It's the ones we usually think about because that's the ones we usually see in television and the ones that students all wish to be able to do. And then there's short-term hibernation, which is things like squirrels. Squirrels tend to do short-term hibernation, which is they sleep for about a week or two, or they sleep for a few days. They wake up, go to the bathroom, eat some food, and then go back to sleep for a few days. The niche species don't use or occupy all of the parts of their habitat at once. The part that we do use is called the niche. So the expected niche, so this is where we expect animals or organisms to show up. So for students, the expected niche is any of these seats. They can sit anywhere in these seats and get the same quality education. They can survive in these ranges, which we'll talk about the different ways to survive in these ranges in the next slide. The realized seat, though, is where they actually show up. So for this particular student, they sit right here. Now, why they sit there could be due to many things. It could be due to the fact that they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend that sits here. It could be that they notice their teacher notices and hands out candy, and that's usually a spot that they call first. It could be that when the bell rings, they want to be the first ones to escape, and so they can run out the door as fast as they can. Or it could be the fact that they have a seating chart, and that's where they are assigned to sit. But that's the expected versus the realized. And why we use those and how we use them are very important, and we go over them in the next slide. So the niche includes a range of conditions that a species can tolerate. It includes the resources it uses, the methods by which it can obtain its resources, the number of offspring it has, its time of reproduction, and all other interactions. So this includes competition, predation, and other types of interactions. Now what I'm drawing here is a breed of bird that uses this particular niche, this little black circle, during different times of the year. So this yellow bird uses it during the spring, but leaves during the winter. And this red bird uses it during the winter, but leaves during the spring. Now they're going to use all the same resources. They use, because it's the same niche, they use all the same resources, they have the same predators, and they obtain their resources the same way. The only reason why they don't go into competition is because they use it during different times of the year. And that's really important. Since they can't interact with each other, it helps them stay out of competition with each other. And it also helps the niche because it means that since you don't have two animals competing over the same thing, you won't run out of food. You won't get a limiting reactant there or a limiting factor there. So we have different types of species. We have a generalist, which is broad niches, can tolerate a range of conditions, and it uses a variety of resources. And then we have a specialist, which lives in narrow niches and uses specific resources. To give some examples of a generalist or a specialist, you'll see that it says possum and koala. The pictures will come up in just a little bit. But some other things of generalist and specialist. Humans are really good generalists. We live everywhere. We can tolerate a range of conditions, and if we can't tolerate it, we find a way to change it to where we can tolerate it. Coyotes, huge generalist. They have gone all over the United States and parts of Canada, where gray wolves are specialists. They need to live in places that fit their niche, and they're slowly being chased out, so they're now having to find new niches and new places to stay. Specialists are generally, they have like one specific thing that makes them choose that niche. So, for example, a panda is a specialist, but this is due to the fact that their specific resource they use is the bamboo. And weirdly enough, it's because it is essentially their candy. They love bamboo. It is a bad food for them. It is not, they are a bear. So the thing that they should be eating is meats and fruits. And they will go out of their way to eat the bamboo versus eating the fruit. So their resources become narrow because they want to eat that bamboo more than anything. So it makes them a specialist. So here's a possum, and here's a koala. Koala is a specialist because it eats the eucalyptus, and the possum is a generalist because it can have that range of conditions and can use a variety of resources. So generalists generally become invasive, and specialists generally are keystone. The reason for this is a generalist can survive in many different areas, reproduce in many areas, and that's what makes them invasive. So if you take a generalist and you place them somewhere else, you can get an invasive species because invasive species can survive and reproduce and outcompete native species. Specialists, they need their specific things. It forces them to be specialists. And if a specialist can find something in a new area to where they can survive and reproduce, that's when they become invasive. They're not naturally there. But majority of the time, a keystone species is where it's at because that's where it has everything it needs. So let's go over a couple of examples of invasive. One of the big ones that is here in Nevada is the quagga mussel, and it originally comes from the Ukraine and was brought over here on boats starting in the Great Lakes, and then it moved throughout the United States. Quagga mussel outcompetes the native mussels in Lake Mead. It outcompetes some of the native animals in Lake Mead, and that's the biggest thing. It outcompetes. And it's dangerous because now it's outcompeting and getting food sources from native mussels that live there. And it also is dangerous, especially in the eyes of engineers, because they're small and that has the chance of getting into Hoover Dam. And that becomes very important because Hoover Dam makes power for 5 different states here in the United States. So it becomes precarious with that, with them. And now, why it's not taken over like that in the Ukraine is because it has a predator. So why don't we bring a predator from over there to eat the quagga mussels over here? Well, that's a very precarious situation. To talk about that, we need to go to a different example of Hawaii. Now, rats are notorious for being invasive because what happened is you get sailors and the sailors will get on this boat, and as the sailors get on the boat, so do the rats. And when the sailors get off the boats, so do the rats. So the rats would get off the boat and they got to Hawaii and they started, as an invasive species, they started growing, breeding like crazy and started outcompeting some native species. So how to combat this was they were like, let's get a mongoose. A mongoose naturally eats rats and they're its predator. So they brought a mongoose over. And the mongoose, well, instead of eating the rats like they were hoping, there are these lovely eggs from the native Hawaiian birds populations. And they're not protected. They didn't have anything like a mongoose before. And well, what ended up happening was instead of going after the rats, they went after the unprotected eggs that couldn't defend itself. So the mongoose would eat the eggs, and every once in a while, if a rat came by, it would eat the rats. And so due to that, a lot of native bird populations in Hawaii are now endangered or extinct. So this is where it becomes, for ecologists, how do we keep a track of invasive species and how do we fight against them? And this is where we look at it from that point of view. So this is where the question goes to you guys. How would you go about going against an invasive species, especially since native species, this is a new species that's coming in and taking over, don't have something to either A, fight against it, or B, they don't know if they can eat it or not.